Okay, so for this whole summer session so far, or the course as it's been, we've studied the basic rules of deductive logic, of inductive logic. We've looked at theories of reasoning, and we've also studied forms of argument generally. Now, these very basic tools that we should now all have in our philosophical tool belt are all that's needed to begin to construct arguments that are really historically and also thematically important for philosophy and the general contribution of thought to human development through history, in the form of proofs for God's existence. Now, I find these arguments fascinating, and I think that they are not only fun philosophical projects to come to learn and understand, but they're also helpful illustrations of the usefulness or the utility of the logic and forms of argument that, even in their most basic form that we've learned in this class, are able to construct arguments as deep and powerful and wide-reaching as proof for the existence of God. So, with that said, we're going to do a bit of philosophy, and we're going to use the logic that we've learned over the summer session in order to do that philosophy. And we're going to be looking at 3 different proofs for God's existence, plus one that's not really a proof. And those 3 proofs are 1, the cosmological argument, 2, the ontological argument, and 3, the teleological argument. So first is the cosmological argument, which is a deductive and theoretical proof for God's existence. It is a proof that, by theoretical, I mean can be done a priori, or without any sort of experience in the world, that just by sitting and thinking really hard, you can come up with this proof for God's existence. And it's deductive because the argument follows the form of deductive logic that we learned in the very beginning of this course, insofar as the proof can be structured in the form of an argument that takes if-then clauses, ands, ors, etc., and is valid, which we'll see that the cosmological proof is valid, then it's going to be deductive. Now, the ontological argument, much like the cosmological argument, is theoretical, so it can be done a priori, and it's deductive insofar as it's going to be a valid argument. Whether or not it's sound, we'll question as we look at historical objections to these arguments, but it is deductively valid. And then finally, we have the teleological proof for God's existence, which is an inductive argument, and there are many forms of it. In fact, there are several forms of all of these arguments. We're just going to be going through one of the formulations, for the sake of time, but they're roughly all the same. They live in the same sort of school, and they might have different premises, but the work that they're trying to do is very much the same. And in the family of teleological proofs for God's existence, often we find inductive proofs, either arguments by analogy, which is going to be what the proof that I've written up for this lecture will cover, or by conditional probability, which is a more modern reformulation of the classic argument by analogy that we're going to be looking at. Now, importantly, the teleological proof, or the family of proofs, is different from the ontological and cosmological because it's inductive. It uses probability and analogy to infer the existence of God. And likewise, it's theoretical. It's also a priori. And so here we have our 3 proofs for God's existence, or our 3 families of proofs. These are going to be what we're talking about for this lecture. But there is one more argument to consider, which is Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is inductive, but it's also practical. It's not theoretical. It's something that we don't use theoretical reasoning to come to its conclusion. Rather, we use what we've learned in our last series of lectures about rational choice theory and expected utility. We're going to practically reason ourselves into a state, according to Pascal, wherein we believe in God, or ought to believe in God as a matter of practical reasoning. So it's not so much an a priori proof as one that requires some sort of agential or person identity level related commitment to the conclusions that we come to. Now, I'm not going to do that in this video. That will be the video that follows this one. In this video, we're just going to talk about these three proofs. Okay. And it's important to note that Pascal's wager is not exactly a proof, strictly speaking, for God's existence, as we'll see. And this is because it is an argument that requires practical reasoning rather than theoretical reasoning. So it's not going to take the form of a proof, but it does get us to a very similar conclusion as our tried and true strict proofs. Okay, so the first argument we're going to be looking at is the ontological argument. This one's my favorite. I love the ontological proof for God's existence. It is a blast. It invariably polarizes students, friends, family, whoever I share this argument with. I think, so, like lovers of food and lovers of movies, if you ask them, like, hey, what's your favorite food, what's your favorite movie, they're not going to be able to tell you because they like it all. They like all of it so much. And similarly in philosophy, oftentimes people ask me, hey, who's your favorite philosopher? What's your favorite argument? And it's really impossible to say, right? Because there's so many beautiful arguments out there. There's so many cool proofs and fantastic constructions. But that said, I think all of them pale in comparison to the ontological proof of God's existence. It's simple, it's powerful, it's beautiful, and it's a ton of fun. And when I say it's a ton of fun, I mean that both sides of the debate are fantastic to jump in on. That the proof itself is beautiful and simple and elegant. And then the objections to it are creative and powerful and thought-provoking. As I said, invariably it polarizes the people that I share it with. Some students or friends or family will hear it and say, what the hell are you talking about, Spencer? Shut up. This is stupid. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How could this be a valid proof at all? And other people on the other side of the fence are awestruck. Now, I wish I could remember my first reaction to the proof, but the more that I work with it, the more fun I have with it. So anyways, that's just a little reverie aside for me. I love this argument. It's a ton of fun. So the ontological proof for God's existence comes to us from Saint Anselm, wearing his big funky pontiff pointy hat with his gold staff. This is Saint Anselm, Bishop of Canterbury. He was exiled twice in his life from Canterbury, took part in all sorts of revolutions in France and Greece and Italy, Europe, came back and made the Archduke of Canterbury like a big deal, and I don't know, he storied life. The Wikipedia page is super cool if you're interested. The ontological argument comes from the Greek for ontos and logos, where ontos means being and logos means reason, or unifying principle is it's not a direct translation, but unifying principle is sort of the semantic content, the real meaning of logos. So the principle or reason for being, the logic of being, is what we mean when we say the ontological argument. So it's an argument about purpose and reason, and the purpose and reason of being itself. So what is the principle of being? Well, this is where we get the word ontology, the study of being. And so an argument from being is our ontological argument. Okay, and here it is. What I've done is I've formalized this argument in terms of premises and conclusions. We've seen arguments that look like this at the beginning of the course. So the first premise, as I formulated the argument, is that God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. God is the greatest thing, the most perfect, infinite being that we can imagine. and there is no being greater than God in our imaginations. So if you think of that being which is more perfect than any other being, that is the most powerful, complete, and awesome figure in your mind that you can imagine. It doesn't even matter that maybe you can't imagine like God, the big guy high in the sky, but just there is something that is like the greatest, most perfect thing you can imagine. God is that thing. Whatever our imagination maximizes out to at its limit, God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. Okay. Premise 2. God exists as an idea in the mind. So whether or not God exists in the world, we're not there yet. But at least I have a maximal conception in my imagination of a perfect being. And that being is who I call God, who exists in my mind as an idea. Okay, premise 3. A being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater, is better than a being that exists only in the mind. It would be better for that maximally perfect imagined being to exist than to not exist. So, for instance, if I could imagine a most perfect being that exists only in my mind, then I could also imagine a being that exists in my mind that is that most perfect being and in the real world. And wouldn't it be better for the real world if such a being existed? If the most perfect being that I could imagine existed in the real world, that would be better for the world and thus better for that being. It would make that being more perfect, right? And that's sort of the reasoning that works at play behind this argument. These are the 3 premises. This is all that we need to prove God's existence with the ontological proof. And we'll begin seeing that fall together here. So from 2 and 3, that God exists as an idea in the mind, and that a being that exists in the mind and in reality is better than a being that exists only in the mind, we get step 4. Thus, if God only exists in the mind, we can imagine it's something that's greater than God. But this is impossible given premise 1, right? We cannot imagine anything greater than God, because God is that being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. Therefore, in conclusion, God exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. Whoa, there it is, right? God exists. So here we have, in 6 steps, that's all it takes, a valid proof for God's existence, right? That God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. Thus, if God only exists in the mind, we can imagine something greater than that thing. But we can't imagine anything greater than God, and we can imagine a being better than the one that exists only in the mind. We can imagine one that exists in the real world too. Therefore, God exists in the real world too. Now, what I've done here, this is a really complicated, fancy proof. We're not going to go through it. You have to take about 3, 4, 5 more years of logic before you get to this point. But the reason I show you this is just to show that this is a valid proof for God's existence. And in fact, if we accept the strongest form of some of our modal logics, which are logics about possibility and necessity, if we accept the strongest form of modal logic, S5 modal logic, this is what that proof looks like, you become committed to God's existence on the basis of this ontological proof. That's another fun aside, something to look forward to if you study logic, continue on, whatever it is. Okay, so here's our ontological proof for God's existence. It's elegant, it's short, it's 6 steps, and it does so much, right? What's wrong with the argument? Well, we can deny premise 1, that God is the being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. This was famously done by Guanillo, another bishop, who was a contemporary of Anselm. And Guanillo argued famously that he could imagine a perfect island. So what Guanillo does is he takes this proof and commits it to what we call in philosophy a reductio ad absurdum. That he takes the proof and reduces it to absurdity. And he does it by this. He replaces the name God in the proof with the perfect island. So Guanello says, well, okay, Anselm, that's an interesting argument. I can imagine an island greater than which no other can be conceived. And it would be better if that island existed in reality than if it just existed in my mind. It would be more perfect that way. Wouldn't it be great to vacation there, right? I suppose by the same premises, by the same form of argument, my perfect island exists. But maybe it doesn't just stop at island. I can imagine the unicorn greater than which no other unicorns, nothing else can be conceived. And wouldn't it be wonderful if this unicorn existed? I would love to go for a ride on a elegant, majestic, rainbow-tailed unicorn. Therefore, by the same form of argument, my perfect unicorn exists. Right? And you can go on like this. The perfect chair. The chair greater than which no other can be conceived. Wouldn't you love to sit in that chair? And so Guanello denies premise one, that God is the being than whom no greater can be conceived, insofar as he says that, well, there can be a perfect island, and therefore that island must exist, and the unicorn, that must exist, the perfect chair. And yet the chair, the unicorn, and the island don't exist. And thus, this form of argument, by denying premise one, must be false. It's valid, but it's not sound, and so it's false, according to Guanello. Now, again, responding on the other side of the debate, one might say, well, what you call the perfect unicorn, I call God. What you call the perfect chair, I call God. That we're really just arguing in not even semantics, but syntax. That we're just using different words to refer to the same object. Now, what Anselm meant is God is that being than whom no greater can be conceived. And by this, he means the maximally perfect being. And there's only one of those things. And whether we call that thing, that being who holds the concept of most perfect, there can only be one, and it can't be any different because it's identical to itself. And if we call that thing a unicorn, if we call it a chair, we call it a perfect island, whatever it is, that being is God, or that being is that than whom no greater can be conceived, and thus the proof still runs through. So this is the dialectic back and forth with regard to premise one. We can also deny premise two, which David Hume famously did. He says, whatever we imagine is finite. Therefore, there's no idea or conception of anything that we call infinite. So, right, premise two is that God exists as an idea in the mind. Now, I think that this is a pretty convincing argument or objection to the ontological proof. In fact, I kind of agree with you. I don't think that we can hold in our minds the idea of an infinite being, and here's why. We are finite beings, and we cannot hold in our minds any infinite series of things. Otherwise, why shouldn't we know all of the numbers before we count to them? Why shouldn't we be able to hold all of the digits of pi in our head at the same time? Rather, what we do is we take this word infinite, and we think of the set of natural numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, on and on, right? And we recognize that series of numbers is infinite, but by calling it infinite, we localize that series into a single unit, into an entity, one object. And it's much easier to call the series infinite than it is to actually imagine the full scope and breadth of the infinity that is all of the natural numbers. It's just, I don't think that it's possible to do so. Neither did Hume. And so if we deny premise two, that God exists in the mind as an idea, this infinite idea, what we're saying is that, wait a second, Anselm, we cannot, as a matter of physical, mental, cognitive limitation, whatever it is, imagine that being greater than whom no other can be conceived, and that being is God. Maybe the best being that I can imagine is, like this PowerPoint clicker. Isn't it the most perfect PowerPoint clicker that ever is? But to prove the existence of such a thing in this way would be ad hoc. It would be silly. It would be an imperfect form of proof. It wouldn't even really be valid, I don't think. because it's just false that because I can imagine a finite thing that finite thing exists. No, the proof requires that we have this imagination of an infinite being. And if you don't think that we can, like Hume, hold the idea of a true infinite, not just a single unit of infinite, the name infinite, in our minds, the whole series of things, then the proof falls through. We can also deny premise 3. Recall that premise 3 says that a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. And this was famously done by Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, 1791, I think is when it was published. Kant argues that existence is not a property, and whether or not a thing exists has no bearing on how good it is. What Kant argues is that existence isn't a property like being red, or having a shadow, or liking Jello, for instance. Existence is sort of an empty space, according to Kant, in which those properties inhere, or they hold in. And whether or not we say that something exists isn't adding or subtracting another property from a thing, but is rather existence is rather sort of like an empty cup that we infer from the fact that there's water being held in place, or an empty container. And insofar as existence is not a property like liking Jello, or being red, or having a shadow, then it's not a thing, according to the proof, that could make God better or worse. That God is perfect in virtue of his having all of the infinitely many good properties that there are. But if existence isn't a property, then we can't morally evaluate it as good. And so it doesn't matter, according to Kant, whether or not we ascribe existence to God in order for the idea of God to be perfect. Now, Kant has his own fun, interesting proof for God's existence that we won't get into in this lecture. But he does object to the ontological proof in a sort of interesting and fun way. Okay, so now that we've done the ontological proof, we're going to move on to the cosmological proof for God's existence, which, like the ontological, is deductive, so it's going to take the form of argument that we studied at the beginning of this course. And likewise, it's going to be theoretical, so it can be done a priori, just given certain principles of reasoning and of logic. It comes to us famously from a few different places. Aristotle, if you're familiar with the concept of a first mover, that is often the most common translation of Aristotle's famous argument for the first mover. It also comes to us from St. Thomas Aquinas, who's holding a giant house and a book of the same size. Like he's some sort of monstrous, gigantic man in this image. And also from one of my all-time favorite philosophers, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz invented calculus and was a brilliant person, librarian, designed bridges as an architect, came up with a cosmological proof for God's existence. Fantastic, brilliant guy. Okay, so the cosmological argument comes from the Greek for cosmos and logos. So it's the reason for the universe. And this should sort of clue you in a little bit to where we're going to go with the rest of the argument. And there's a few different versions. We're going to be going over the causal version of the cosmological argument. And again, I've formulated your argument in terms of premises and conclusions, which is that 1, all things that exist, if something exists, then there's a reason that it exists. It has a cause. 2, that the universe is a thing that exists. Presumably, okay, right? Now we're going to combine these two premises. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. If something exists, then it has a cause. The universe exists, therefore the universe has a cause, right? That's modus ponens. 4, the only sort of thing that could cause the universe is God. Therefore, God caused the universe. Boom. There you go. there's another proof for God's existence, like that, right? In 5 steps, one less than my formulation of the ontological proof. And over here, I've formulated what your argument looks like in our deductive form. So we should all be able to read this now. At the end of the course, what we've done is we know what these symbols are, right? The ampersands are dots in our book, and the arrows are horseshoes. But what I've done is I've formalized if the universe exists, be as U, then it has a cause, C. So the universe exists here, has a cause, C. If something exists, then it has a cause. The universe exists. Now we apply modus ponens, and we get C, right? We get that there is a cause for the universe. So the universe exists, and it has a cause. And then finally we get another premise, which is premise 4, which is that if the universe exists and it has a cause, then God caused it. Well, we have U and C, right here. Therefore, God caused the universe. Now, it's important to note that this argument doesn't imply necessarily the existence of a Christian or any other particularly theologized God, a God with any sort of content. Rather, it proves a very thin notion of God. The notion of God is just that which is required to start the universe. So in this sense, much like we might have called the perfect island or the perfect unicorn or the perfect chair the same name as God, likewise we might call the Big Bang or the first turn of the wheel or the first mover or even the theological God of any sort of religion or from any pantheon of big powerful high-ups as that which would satisfy the premises here. So again, we're going to look at what's wrong with this argument. Well, we could give up premise 1, which says that all things that exist have a cause, but this comes at the cost of our scientific intuitions. In order to do science, we assume that when we study a phenomena, we're going to be able to look at the effects of that phenomena and infer what the phenomena is from it. That we can infer from the growth of grass in a sage scrub area that the sage scrub has been cut out, and that primary succession is now taking over, right? So there's some sort of effect, which is that grass is growing in an area that it shouldn't be growing in, and maybe we're studying this because there's been tons of soil erosion in these pastures in the West, right? So we want to find out why there's soil erosion. Well, we look at the effect, which is the growth of grass where it ought not to be. And then we infer from it a cause, which is that the sage scrub has been cut out. And because there's no more sage scrub, it gives time for succession to take over and grass to grow. And then the grass dies because it's really hot and dry, and the soil erodes. Whereas the sage scrub puts down certain roots that keep the soil together. And so basically what I've done is I've constructed a story about an effect that requires certain causes. And this is the way in which we do all of science. In fact, in which we pretty much live all of our lives all the time. So to give up premise 1 seems untenable. And we likely don't want to give up premise 2. I mean, you can, right? The universe is a thing that exists. Even if you want to say the universe is like an illusion or we're all in a dream, man, right? Then there's still some form of existence to it, right? Like, here we are. Whether it's illusory or dreamlike doesn't seem to capture the full strength of the force of a negative claim like the denial of 2, which would be to say that, there's nothing, right? Nothing. The universe doesn't exist, it just is empty. Because it's not. There's stuff here. I'm experiencing it right now. You are too. We're all here, right? So we probably don't want to give up premise 2. So this leaves us with 3 and 4. And we could deny premise 4. We could say that the only sort of thing that could cause the universe is God. Well, we could say maybe we don't want to commit to the existence of God, and so we say causes can go back infinitely. That I don't feel it necessary that there be a first, right? Now, this is what inspired all of these thinkers, Aristotle, Aquinas, and largely Leibniz, to conclude that the cosmological proof implies the existence of a God, which is that to say that causes span back infinitely is like a reductio ad absurdum. It's to say that no matter how many steps back we go, we can continue going and going and going, that there's no bottoming out of our reasoning, of our search for answers. And because there's no bottoming out, it's famously turtles all the way down, right? Turtles on the backs of turtles is the foundation of the universe. You've probably heard this story, right? That the kid asks the elder, where's the world? Well, the world is sitting on the back of a turtle. And the kid says, well, where's the turtle sitting? And the elder says, on the back of another turtle. And the kid says, well, where's that one sitting? The elder says, it's turtles all the way down. And we might be willing to accept a premise like this, or a supposition, in which case we might deny for. If you're okay with causes extending backwards infinitely, then you don't need to be committed to a first turn of the wheel or a first cause. And like I mentioned after stating the argument, accepting this argument doesn't commit us to the existence of any particular kind of God. The argument only commits us to the existence of some kind of thing that can have caused the universe to exist. The Big Bang, maybe God, maybe some giant flying pile of spaghetti and meatballs, right? Whatever it is that acts as the first cause, that's what this argument indicates must exist. Unless we are willing to suppose that it can be turtles all the way down as far as the principle of sufficient reason goes. Which the principle of sufficient reason is just our first premise, which is that for any effect, there's a cause that sufficiently explains that effect, right? Okay, so that's the cosmological argument. Now, we're going to move on to the teleological argument. And this argument, family of arguments, looks a little different than our other ones, the ontological and the cosmological. And this is because it's inductive. And it comes to us from Mr. William Paley right here. And the family of teleological arguments comes from the Greek for telos and logos, where telos is end or purpose, the end of a thing being the reason that I'm in graduate school is to get my PhD. All of my actions in my course program right now are for the sake of a particular end, which is getting the PhD, right? So the PhD is my telos, and that telos guides all of my actions. And logos is sort of the reason. So what we're looking at with the teleological argument is reasoning from the end, or reasoning from the purpose, reasoning from that concluding state. And here's a quote. I'm going to read it for you because I recognize that it's probably kind of hard to see on the screen. This is from Paley in his book Natural Theology from 1802. And he says, "In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. It could have just arrived there moments ago. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time, and at some other place or other, an artificer or artificers, who formed the watch for the purpose with which we find it actuality to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design, which existed in the watch, exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation." Okay, so this is a long in 1800s way of saying, I was walking along one day and stubbed my toe on a rock. If someone were to ask me, how did that rock get there, you might have said, well, for all I know, this thing could have literally been sitting on the ground forever until I kicked it, right? However, if I were going for a walk and I stubbed my toe and I look down and I've stubbed my toe on a really intricate fancy watch, I wouldn't say, like the stone, that that object, that watch, could have been there forever. The stone conceivably could have just appeared there and stayed there since the beginning of time. A watch, however, is too intricate. It has gears that are tiny, itty bitty, these little mechanisms that serve a function, that compute and have a particular kind of power, can't have been laying on the ground forever. That objects like the watch must have been created. They must have had an artificer, right? And so if I stub my toe on a watch, I assume that it was put there, left there by some creator, by somebody who got it from the creator, right? And then in the second half of the quote, Paley analogizes nature with the watch. He says, look, nature has all of these different systems that commingle and harmonize with one another, that there's coral reefs that sustain life, that feed the bottom feeders of the ocean, who help the ocean stay temperate and sequester carbon when the glaciers melt, and the glaciers melting causes the evolution of new species. That nature is a vastly complex system that works together intricately and has a particular kind of mechanism. And insofar as this mechanism of nature is very much like the mechanism of the intricate gears of the watch, we can infer, says Paley, from the analogy that the watch has a high probability of having been created by an artificer or a creator, that it would be absolutely insane. Probability 0.0 repeating 1, right? That a watch just like was created naturally. Paley says the same of nature, because nature is much like the watch. It has intricate mechanisms. And so it is likely highly probable, as probable as it is that the watch has a creator, that nature has a creator as well. Okay, so here's our analogical version using the argument by analogy. Entity E within nature, or the cosmos, or nature itself, is analogized with a specified human artifact A, like a watch or a machine, in relevant respects R, that they're both highly intricate, interconnected, and harmonic systems. 2. Artifact A has relevant respects R precisely because it is a product of deliberate design by intelligent human agency. So the watch has the intricate mechanisms and harmonic functions in virtue of the intelligence of the creator who made the gears just so that the watch could tell time. Like effects typically have like causes. Two watches could be created by two different manufacturers, but they're pretty similar, right? At the end of the day, even though the brand of the watches is different, they were both intelligently created, right? Therefore, it is highly probable that E, the entity within nature itself, right, that we're analogizing with the artifact, the watch, it's highly probable that the universe has the mechanisms and highly intricate harmonic functions precisely because it too is a product of deliberate design by intelligent, relevantly human-like agency. And so what we see in this argument is, one, that it's inductive. It says it is highly probable, right, that the universe in virtue of its harmonic function, the intricacies of nature. It's highly probable, given our premise 3, that nature is very much like the watch. And so we can infer from that probability that nature has intelligent design. Now, this is also a very popular argument right now. It's appearing all over the place in politics. Maybe not exactly in this awesomely, inductively construed form, but it is important to know, right? If you don't think that intelligent design is a thing, this is the kind of argument that you need to be contending with, right? Or if you do think intelligent design is a thing, then what you need to do is strengthen the analogy between the watch and nature, and maybe even buffer up something like premise 3. Right? So this is the basic form of the analogical proof, teleological proof for God's existence. So what's wrong with the argument? Well, we could deny premise 1, and again, David Hume does this. He says that nature and the various things in it are not very much like human artifacts. And human artifacts and nature exhibit substantial differences. For instance, in nature things live and human artifacts don't. We can create machines, but they're not alive, so far as we can tell, pretty much. Humans, objects in nature, are alive. And so to analogize between something so substantially different as a living thing and a non-living thing and say, well, we're able to make watches. A watch is kind of like me, therefore I must have been made just like I made the watch. Hume says, no, that's not going to work. We can't make that analogy. The analogy entailed by 1 is too weak to get the probabilistic form of argument to run. Now, there are other problems with the argument, but for the sake of time, we will move on. So what we've done in this lecture is we've looked at 3 different proofs for God's existence, 2 of which on this 2/3 of the circle, the deductive, or the cosmological and ontological portions were deductive. And we've also just looked at a teleological proof, which is inductive, an argument by analogy, all for God's existence. And this all we can now understand because of the basic tools that we've learned throughout the rest of the course. I hope this has been fun. I love this kind of stuff, and I find it really inspiring that just from the little pieces of logic, we can, do so much neat, fun arguing, right? But as it turns out, these aren't the only arguments for belief in God. All of them are theoretical, right? So the one that we have yet to look at is Pascal's wager, which is not going to be theoretical and a matter of the mind, but is going to be practical, a matter of action. And that is what we will look at in the next video.